I think it's a really fascinating, really interesting fossil. I mean, nothing like this has ever been seen before. Most of the
line that goes to humans and monkeys and apes. So that's the facts as they might be. When you really look into the paper, it becomes less clear whether how you can assign which part of the tree you can assign this fossil to. But Brian knows a bit more about that.
Okay, but just before I bring in Brian, I mean, the media excitement is not just predicated on is it or isn't it a lemur. It's gone a bit further than that, I think you can safely say.
Yeah, the media excitement comes from the press release, really, and the way it was all announced. And so, I mean, normally we get papers a few days in advance of publication, but in this case, we heard a rumour that there was a big paper coming out. There was nothing, and then suddenly we all got emails saying that the eighth wonder of the world was being unveiled. It was the Rosetta Stone.
You're paraphrasing, I guess.
Effectively. Well, I mean, they said this changes everything. You know, they really made a big hoo-ha about it. But then we didn't really have time to go into the paper and look at the paper, and that's what most of the media didn't have time to do. They just went with what was in the press release and trumpeted it as this Rosetta Stone of evolution, the eighth wonder of the world. But then when you spend the time to look at the paper more, then that may be questionable.
But of course now you're spending the time after all the massive...
Yeah, we didn't have the chance, and maybe even scientists in the peer review process didn't have the chance to do that either.
Brian Sweeting, what do you make of this?
I think it's a really fascinating, really interesting fossil. I mean, nothing like this has ever been seen before. Most of the primate fossil record, especially the early fossil record, is just teeth. You try and study early fossil primates and you don't have very much more to work with than, a couple of fragments of bone and a few teeth. So this is the first time that something like this has been found, something that's so exceptionally preserved.
Because it's not even just I think there's traces of skin and contents of stomach as well.
The bacteria that latched onto the carcass when it was being decayed and fossilized left the body outline. They seem to have found some stomach contents. So we can learn quite a bit about the paleobiology of this animal as well, what it was like while it was alive and the kind of environment it lived in.
But what about the actual paper? Could it have appeared in a kind of more routine way in one of the mainstream journals like Nature?
It absolutely could have. There's been a few quotes coming out now. I think one was published earlier today in the Australian that the whole process might have been a little bit rushed, but it could have definitely come out in Science or Nature or something like that. It really just blows the doors off of everything that we've found in terms of how much of the skeleton is there, but in terms of its significance to human evolution, it being the common ancestor of us all and things like that, it doesn't quite measure up. It seems to be more related to lemurs and the side branch of primate evolution that diverged about 50 million years ago, and not the line that led to monkeys and apes.
But I mean, I think we've had a quick spin through the David Attenborough TV documentary, no mention of missing link. I think at the press conference, I don't think anybody directly who's announcing it said missing link. So are the scientists and the team who are kind of launching this to blame if the media get into a bit of a frenzy?
Like you said, I think the media has been the main outlet where the term missing link has been used, and I think it's just because it's popular. People know that phrase. It's a hook. The scientists themselves, though, have been hyping it as a, quote, Rosetta Stone, like man landing on the moon. So even though they haven't exactly used the phrase missing link, they have been saying that this is probably one of our ancestors. I think Hiram, one of the main authors on the paper, said this is the closest thing we can get to a direct ancestor. And this is in stark contrast to what they actually say in the paper. They're a little bit more reserved in their analysis in the paper, but then you have these things like the book and the website revealing the link and the missing link. So there seems to be some kind of disconnect between what's in the paper and how it's being essentially sold.
And of course in the TV documentary there's these lines about every person on the planet. And Rowan, I suppose also on top of this, we have to say, if it is Darwin year, which it is, and you unveil a fossil which is an ancient primate, and it's an amazing link, and you give it a name with Darwin in the title, it is not entirely unpredictable that some people are going to make the link to the missing link.
Absolutely, yeah. It's funny you mentioned the name, that there's been some suggestion now that it might exist in real life, because to be guaranteed to be to go into scientific nomenclature, it has to be published in a real paper journal, and it's been published in this online journal. So under
there's a whole serious business about taxonomy. Who has rights?
It's like arcane rules, but they're the rules, and it turns out that the rules haven't been followed. So it doesn't actually that name Darwinius
Macilla
doesn't actually isn't official yet.
And interesting as well is the fact that while the mainstream media kind of have been very enthusiastic, had a headline from the BBC website's fairly typical, stunning fossil find unveiled. If you go to the science journals like Nature and Science, you see headlines like reunion of fossil halves splits scientists and revolutionary fossil fails to dazzle paleontologists. So we're getting this caution, but the caution is not necessarily being expressed too much in the mainstream.
Absolutely, it's been media driven, totally. So I mean, I heard that this the transmission date of the TV show was set before the paper had been fully peer reviewed. So it effectively capped the peer review process. So, I mean, the obvious...
and I think there's a book coming out.
The book's probably out on the same day.
Yeah.
But...
That's the danger of interrupting somebody. They can just lose their train of thought. So let me carry with my train of thought. I mean, surely the flip side of that is we complain sometimes, particularly in the science area, when stories disappear without trace, that you think surely people should get excited about this. Here is a story that has been launched with a bit of showbiz razzmatazz and a bit of thought about PR. Can we blame it if it's really caught on in the public imagination?
We can't blame them. I mean, you've got to take your hat off to them for doing a fantastic job. But the problem for us is when scientists are able to look at this properly and start saying, well, hang on, is it really, what's the actual evidence for it being a common ancestor of the human line? And when that turns out to be less valid, then no one's going to trumpet it as loudly as they have the initial results. It also might feed into creationists who say, oh look, they're trumpeting some bad fossil.
Yes, the creation versus evolution. Brian, just briefly, your piece I think was called Poor Either, or Overselling an Adipid. There's a lot of other kind of very passionate pieces appearing online. Will they make a difference to how this is viewed?
To some extent. I mean, I've gotten a lot of attention from a lot of outlets like New York Times and Popular Science, things like that, so it is making somewhat of a difference. I see my traffic go through the roof. But I think in the long term, what's going to matter to the public is the documentary, is the book, is the selling of this fossil. But be that as it may, the real story has to do with what Ida really has to tell us about primates and evolution during this time period. Those debates have been going on for years, for decades, and they're going to continue to go on. Hopefully some of that will continue to be popularized and brought out as the scientists debate this fossil.
Okay, let's start with there, Brian Switek, Rowan Hooper, thanks. And although it may not be helpful to think of Darwinius Macilla in terms of the missing link, it is an anagram of Shaw is a wild animal. And what may be slightly more helpful is to see the film, which is on BBC One on Tuesday. More on everything we've covered today on the Material World web pages within bbc.co.uk.